services again. But today we're starting a brand new series, and I've already heard from some of you. Why are we doing a series about Mama Knows Best on Father's Day? So let me explain. We planned this series like pre-COVID. We were going to start this series, right? And so it just kind of timed itself out this way. But the thing is, right? Okay, even if you don't agree with it, Dad, and don't want to admit it, Mamas pretty much know best for the most part anyway. And even if you don't agree with me, it's probably just smart just to kind of nod and say right. But for the next few weeks, all right, we're gonna be following with Jesus or John as he followed along with Jesus through his gospel. But before we jump into all his eyewitnesses accounts, I want to talk about a tension that's there throughout the entire book that we need to understand, because maybe one of the most misunderstood words, especially when it comes to faith and religion, but specifically to Christianity, is this word believe. And when I say that, okay, you kind of know what believe means. You believe in some things. You know what that means. But for some reason, this word just kind of gets hijacked a little bit when we drop it into a religious context. Like in the real world where you work, where you have friendships, relationships, where we play, we generally believe in things based on evidence and trust. Okay, think about this. That's why you would say you believe in something. Evidence, trust. In other words, you make decisions about what you believe or don't believe based on how you see it work, how you experience it, and based on how much confidence you have in the person that's telling you, giving you the information, right? Like when you were a kid, at some point you probably learned that 8 times 8 equals, nice, good, one of you knows that, 8 times 8 equals 64. Chances are, though, okay, you didn't go home and just kind of lay out, okay, 8 apples, 8 in rows, and just kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You just kind of took your teacher's word for it until it became more practical to you. Why? Because you trusted your teacher. She told you the truth before. But from time to time, there's conflicting information. You get 2 different pieces of information. You're not sure what to believe. For example, and this might be the most important question that gets asked all morning. Does running actually hurt your knees? Because runners love to hear that from people. Like, oh, I would run, but it'll ruin your knees, right? And you could probably point me to a lot of studies and a lot of broke down people with really, really bad knees to say, that's why you shouldn't run so much, because it's going to ruin your knees. I could also point you to studies and people who've been running for decades who would say, no, running actually helps strengthen my knees, right? So which one is it? I mean, it's hard to say. It depends on which side of those things you are. I kind of tend to believe you're going to have bad knees whether you run or not if you're just prone to have bad knees. But so far, my knees are fine. I think running probably messes with your head a lot more than it messes with your joints, right? Or how about this question, maybe a little more relevant for you, is coffee still a good thing for you in terms of your health? Is coffee still good for us? And I sure hope so, because I drink a lot of it. But the truth is, even if you could show me studies that coffee is no longer good for you, I probably wouldn't care, right? And I'd probably still drink some coffee. That's how our beliefs tend to work. It's called cognitive bias. Anybody ever heard this phrase before? It's just human nature. It's where I decide I'm just not going to listen to that because I don't like it, right? It's a bias. You only listen to the information that confirms what you already believe, right? I'm going to find what I like, and then that's what I'm going to believe. And it's a little bit backwards. But when it comes to like coffee and running, I tend to pay more attention to the research that I like that confirms what I already want to believe, right? You do this too, whether it's true or not. Now, I'm not saying that's smart. I'm just saying that's natural. We all do it. And don't come up to me later on trying to tell me you're immune to this and you don't do this either, because I could point you to some studies that prove that all of us do this, right? But the point is this. We all know what it means to believe in something. But what we're going to learn from walking alongside John as he bears witness to Jesus is that when it comes to this word believe, it doesn't just like automatically take on some new meaning when it's connected to faith in Jesus. Believe is believe. So I want you to get this, okay? Religious belief is often confused with what we say is hope. And hope is good. We all know what hope is, and I love hope. Hope is what keeps us going, especially through hard times like this, right? But for some reason, okay, when it comes to religious belief, it takes on a life of its own, and all of a sudden hope can become sort of like when we say, well, I hope he shows up. Well, why would you hope he shows up? Well, he didn't show up last time, but did he show up the time before that? No, but I sure hope he shows up, right? And it's good to have hope, but understand, okay, there's a big difference between hope and confidence. There's two different things. So, unfortunately, when it comes to faith, when it comes to our belief and things we can't explain sometimes, some of us grew up just hearing things like, well, can't explain it, you just got to believe it, right? Which sounds like good faith, maybe. You just got to believe. Or if you grew up in the South like I did, it was, well, you just got to believe, brother, right? Just got to believe it, brother. You got to take it by faith. Or maybe you even told at some point that you just need to have more faith, which can be really kind of disturbing because it doesn't even really make sense if you think about it, because you either have faith or you don't. You either believe or you don't. You can have different levels of trust that we act on. There's a time when you got to try to figure stuff out. But when it comes to Christianity, a lot of us were taught, you just got to believe, sister. You got to believe it, brother. And some of you may not believe me on this without checking it out for yourself, and I would encourage you to do that. But you don't find that in the teachings of Jesus. Jesus never taught belief that way. You don't find that in the New Testament. And as we walk alongside Jesus through this gospel, this eyewitness account of John, we're going to discover a totally different way of embracing faith, and maybe many of us were even taught growing up. Because John would tell you, okay, I didn't choose to follow Jesus because of faith. I didn't just take it by faith, brother. John didn't choose to follow Jesus because of faith, and he would caution you against that as well. He chose to follow Jesus by faith, based on what he saw. Okay? And if the only reason you're following Jesus is because somebody told you, well, you just got to believe, and it was an emotional experience, and then I've got some good news for you, okay? There's a lot more to it than just that. And we're going to learn that there's a huge difference between because of faith and by faith. Faith is based on evidence. Belief is based on evidence. It's not the other way around. I like what one author, a speaker, Frank Turek, he's a really popular apologist. He'll debate anybody when it comes to Christianity and faith, and does a really good job with it. But he said one time, we humans have this fatal tendency to try to adjust the truth to fit our beliefs rather than adjusting our beliefs to fit the truth. And that's something I just got to own, because I know I'm guilty of that. But the Apostle Paul, okay, he took his first steps towards following Jesus. He left his father's business, everything that was secure to him, not because of faith, but because of what he saw. He saw something that convinced him. In fact, he outlived most of his friends by the time he actually wrote his gospel. He was the last. He was like the lone survivor as it related to all the apostles and disciples of Jesus. And apparently, okay, finally somebody got to John and just said, hey, man, you've got to tell us what you saw, what you experienced. You've got to share this. You need to tell your story. You were an eyewitness. And so he did. And again, it came down to us through what we now call the gospel. And the word gospel just means good news, through the gospel of John. Okay, but here's the cool thing that I think makes John different than the others. John was not content to just tell us what happened, right? He's not just giving us a historical record here. John is going to tell us why it happened and why he wants us to know it happened. And in the very end of his gospel, he gives us like this purpose statement, or maybe this like thesis statement. If you remember back to college or even high school, maybe you had to write term papers and things, and maybe the teacher made you write a thesis paper. It's kind of like this real short summary of the whole thing. Here's the big idea. Well, John kind of saves his thesis statement, his purpose statement, to the very end of his gospel. And we're going to go all the way back to the beginning and look at and journey alongside with him and Jesus. But here's his purpose statement. Here's what he said, why he wrote. He said, the disciples saw Jesus do many other miraculous signs in addition to the ones recorded in this book. Okay, in other words, there was a lot more I could have said. And he's also making sure we know, okay, everything I wrote about, this wasn't just something where nobody saw it. Okay, we were there. And this book doesn't refer to the Bible as you and I know it. This is talking about a document that John was writing. So John says, look, I've told you a lot of things Jesus said, but he said a lot more. I've explained a lot of things he did, but he did a lot more. So he says, but these are written, the things I chose to include in my account, these are written so that you may continue to believe. There's our word, right? The purpose for me writing, he says, is because I don't want you to just simply know what Jesus did. I don't want you to just simply know what Jesus said. That's important. But these are written that you may believe. I want you to believe, but I'm not content in just saying, well, you just got to believe, brother, right? You got to take it by faith. No, he says, I want you to journey with me. I want you to experience Jesus the way I did as best you can. And my hope is that you'll experience Jesus in such a way, he says, through my experience, that you'll be convinced that he is who he claimed he was. That he's not just simply telling us what to believe, okay? He's building a case as to why we should believe it. Because John didn't embrace this crazy idea of faith or belief that just kind of hangs out there by itself, okay? But believe what? He wants us to believe. He's very specific. He goes on to say, believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing in him, you will have life by the power of his name. And he just kind of laid out a sequence we're going to see over and over again that brought him to the point of his own belief in faith. And it's the very same sequence he's going to lay out in his gospel for us. And it basically goes like this, okay? He gives us events. And as it turned out, these weren't just random events, okay? They pointed to something. They were signs that pointed to something greater. And those signs pointed to something in such a way that they serve as evidence. And because of the evidence, because of what he saw, because of what I heard, he said, I believed that Jesus was who he claimed to be. And when I began to believe in Jesus and who he claimed to be based on the evidence, the signs, the events, then I placed my trust in him. Okay, and that's kind of the sequence he followed. And here's why this is so important. John did not begin with I placed my trust in Jesus and I hoped it would work out, right? I just took it on faith. In fact, throughout his gospel account in Matthew and Mark's and Luke's, what we actually find, and you see this over and over again, okay, they believed, but then they doubted, right? But then they believed again, but then they had some big questions. And they believed, but then they dropped the ball, right? And they weren't so sure because they weren't easy to convince. But they didn't just believe in superstition, okay? They weren't trying to sort this out, and in the end, it wasn't faith that convinced them. It was what they saw. It was what they heard that was undeniable to them. So John is writing to us with that same purpose. He doesn't just give us these random events and conversations with Jesus. He organizes them in what he calls signs. And there's 7 of them we're going to look at through this series. And we're going to look at all of them. But here's something interesting before we just jump briefly into that this morning. It's interesting to me that he actually uses the word sign and not miracle. That's a lot of times what we would call them. But I think it's important we know that all these supernatural acts of Jesus, all the healings, the walking on the water, the turning the bread, the stone into bread, all those cool things, they weren't just acts of kindness, and they weren't just Jesus showing off. They weren't just him trying to make a name for himself. These were signs pointing to something. And John realized that when he saw them. And what they pointed to specifically was Jesus' identity. This is who I am. And you can believe that I am who I say I am, and I'll do what I'll say I'll do. So John does his best in this gospel to help us not become just Jesus groupies or fascinated with all the miracles, but he wants us to become fascinated with the person that the miracles are pointing to. All right, so there's the big introduction. Any questions so far? All right, good. Let's jump in. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on this first miracle today because I've already used most of my time today, and I know you're itching. It's Father's Day. But this is a really cool one. It's really familiar. It's pretty well known to everybody anyway, so another reason we don't have to spend a lot of time on it. In fact, when John gave us his eyewitness account, he doesn't even tell us this miracle when you see it because he just kind of assumes that everybody reading this already knew about it. Now, why would he assume that? Well, here's why, okay? This is really, really important too. Because by the time John finally got down to documenting his story, it was already such a part of the Christian teaching. It was already circulating out there, the story of Jesus, that he almost doesn't even have to give us the details. By this time, Christians were already reading this and being like, oh, yeah, I remember that. You remember that? Yeah. So the first sign that John writes about was the turning the water into wine. Remember this in Cana? And it starts in chapter 2. It tells us the next day there was a wedding celebration in the village of Cana of Galilee, and Jesus' mother was there. And now what we find out later in this account is that Mary, Jesus' mother, was part of the hosting committee. She had a pretty important role at this wedding somehow. Perhaps she was part of the group that did the catering, but she had a big responsibility. It says, and Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the celebration, which means that John was there. John was eyewitnessing exactly what was going on. This wasn't just something he heard about. So now weddings in this day, I don't know if you've ever studied it, they weren't just like an hour or two like we have and maybe a little dinner afterwards. These could last for days, even a week or longer. And that's why what happened next was such a catastrophe. Even though it might be a similar catastrophe as something like this were to happen at your wedding, right? It says the wine supply ran out during the festivities, so Jesus' mother told him they have no more wine. All right, so imagine, okay, you're married, you're in charge of this. This is your responsibility. Imagine at your wedding, your son or daughter's wedding or your wedding, if something that was really, really central to everybody having a good time all of a sudden is just gone. The embarrassment, the weight that just kind of fell on her. And suddenly it's just like this really embarrassing moment. So Mary turns to Jesus. She kind of knew that in a crisis she could probably lean on her very resourceful son, right? It's kind of like, to me, she knew something about that, which just kind of makes you curious. Like, what was it like to grow up with Jesus? Like if she needed something from the grocery store and didn't want to go out, she could just be like, hey, Jesus, can you just kind of do your thing and get me. I don't even need to know how you do it, right? Just help me out. Anyway, somehow she knew it was okay to turn to Jesus in this crisis. But the way Jesus responds to her, in a lot of our Bibles, it almost comes across a little offensive. He says to this, in my version it says, dear woman. In like the NIV, I believe it just says woman. Woman. And that's not something I would suggest you go home and try it with your mom or your wife or anything, right? Even if you're quoting Jesus, don't even try to pull that one. I'm just saying Jesus said. But back then, this was actually a term of endearment. Okay, it would kind of be more like he was saying to his mom, my lady, something really, really formal like that to keep it, maybe because they were in public or something. Regardless, he says, dear woman, that's not our problem. Well, dear son, I wouldn't have brought it to your attention, right, if it wasn't my problem. But Jesus tells her, no, my time has not yet come. Mom, okay, I've come to save the world, not weddings, right? This is not how I plan to go public, okay? This just doesn't even feel very messianic, right? So Mary, I just kind of see her just like most moms. I think she just kind of smirks at him and is like, whatever. So look at verse 5. His mother told the servants, do whatever he tells you. It's like she's not even listening to this. I'm your mom, do what I told you to do. And she just walks off. That sound like anybody's mom to you? Does it sound familiar? Because she's the mom, right? Mama knows best, so she can do this. Now what's so cool, and this is why John saw this, okay? Because when you read this story, you might think, well, what kind of sign is that? It's like the most random just kind of thing that walked into the story. He didn't heal anybody. There's not even really a big spiritual lesson here. Why would John start with this? Maybe as an old man, right, he's writing this and he's thinking back and he remembered this and it just kind of dawned on him, I think, oh, wow, this was actually the perfect way for Jesus to introduce himself to people. Even though the wedding guests, think about this, they never even knew what happened. Most of the wedding guests had no clue that a miracle had just been performed. They were just enjoying the wine. But John seemed to know that like for us future readers, this was the perfect introduction to the message of Jesus and ministry of Jesus. And here's why. When this begins to make sense next in verse 6, he says, standing nearby with these 6 stone water jars used for ceremonial washing. And each could contain, he said, about 20, 30 gallons. So this host family, they were apparently very wealthy. And they were good Jewish people. And so the Jewish customs and laws back then demanded that they do all kinds of ceremonial washings to stay clean before certain events. And so that's what these jars were for. Really large jars. They're sitting there empty. But, okay, and here's the significance of this. These clay jars, they're kind of icons. They're symbols of the traditions and the covenants that Jesus had actually come to replace. All right? And to me, this is so brilliant that Jesus would decide to go public with who he is by using something that would soon be replaced with what would soon be put into place. Right? Follow with me. We've talked about this, okay? That God's temporary covenant with the nation of Israel, it was disappearing. It had served its purpose, and now Jesus has come to bring something completely new. And he's about to introduce it, right? Now, when it was given, okay, the law of the covenant was way, 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 way ahead of its time. But it had a timer on it, and that covenant was slowly coming to an end, and these jars, they kind of represented that, the ceremony, the Jewish temple system, right? And Jesus decides to use this moment to illustrate something that nobody there would understand until later. It was still kind of under the radar, but it was so significant. It was so brilliant. God's temporary arrangement with what was disappearing, and something new had come. Something brand new was here because someone new was on the scene. And the story continues. Jesus told the servants, fill the jars with water. It's like you've done this a bunch of times before, right? Just do what you've always done like you would normally do. But he's like, but we're not going back to normal after this. Something's going to happen. And then they're going to do something they've never done before. Like the old is passing away, the new is coming, someone new has come. And so the text goes on. When the jars had been filled, he said, now, dip some out, take it to the master of ceremonies. So the servants followed his instructions. And so this master of ceremonies, he was responsible for what was served. And he was responsible for when it was served and who got served first and all of that. So the master tastes the water. All right, and think about this too. Pull back for just a second, because if you didn't already know this story, you'd be thinking, oh no, okay, he's going to drink what he thinks is wine, and it's just water. They just fill these jars with water, right? It's going to be really embarrassing, and he's going to drink, so it's going to be water. But again, okay, do you realize John never even tells us a miracle took place. He just kind of assumes, because John assumed everybody who's heard this knows how it ends. So here's how he writes it. When the master of ceremonies tasted the water that was now wine, he assumes everybody already knows, not knowing where it come from, though of course he says the servants knew, he called the bridegroom over. And he said this, okay, this is amazing. He tells him, a host always serves the best wine first, and then when everybody's had a lot to drink, right, when their senses are numb and they don't really care anymore, he brings out the less expensive stuff. It's like, I've never seen this before. We usually serve like the cheap stuff last when they don't care what it tastes like. By the end of the night, right, by the end of the week, nobody cares. They don't even know. He said, and this is so powerful, though, when you understand the significance. He told him, but you have kept the best until now. And I don't think I even really got the significance of what the master just said until I was even preparing to kind of teach this again this week. Because God had kept the best until this moment as well. God had kept the best until now in this moment too. Something new was coming. And just like that old wine set the table for this better wine in the end, in the same way God was bringing the nation of Israel, his people, this established a covenant that would set up the world to expect one to come to fulfill that covenant. There was a context here that made sense, and the original wine set up the coming of the new, the better wine. And so Jesus uses this illustration right there at the wedding feast in Cana to say to the world, even though the world at the time wouldn't understand it, he says something new has come. Something better has come. That there was nothing wrong with what came before, but what came before was to establish what is here now. And we're going somewhere different. We're going somewhere new. In other words, this was more than just a miracle, right? This was a sign. This pointed to something much bigger than just water and wine. It pointed to something in somebody, but nobody would fully understand it until later. And so John kind of ends the story by just simply saying this miraculous sign at Cana in Galilee was the first time Jesus revealed his glory. And don't miss this, and his disciples believed in him. There's that little connector word. And in the Greek, there's actually two words there that goes beyond just simple belief. They put their trust in him. That's what John was saying. They put their trust in him. Because here's the question, okay? Why did they believe in him? Because they saw him do a cool trick, because he got them together and said, come on, guys, come on. You got to believe. You just got to believe. I know I can't explain it. You just got to believe. You just got to trust me, right? Just have faith, sister. Just have faith, brother. You just got to believe. No. The reason they believed is because there was a reason to believe. They saw something that convinced them. And so from the very outset, John in his gospel establishes this paradigm. We're going to find it throughout, because never once has anybody ever asked to believe. No one's ever asked to trust in Jesus without there being evidence or without there being confidence in the person that brings the information. It's not just blind faith that we're asked to accept. And maybe you've never been told this before, but we're not asked just to believe. We're not required to just take it by faith. Faith is an important part to what we do. But what makes Christianity so significant, so different, is that we've been invited to believe what happened based on the testimony of the people that were actually there. People like John. And we don't know exactly where, exactly how he wrote this, but we know that the Apostle Peter at this time was already dead. And we know that the Apostle Paul was dead. And again, he was probably the last disciple left. But in spite of all of that, it was because of what he saw, because of what he experienced, not because of what he just kind of had to white-knuckle himself into believing in spite of. Not just because of what he'd heard, not even because of just what he had faith. He arrives at the most famous conclusion ever when he wrote, you remember this? Because of what I've seen, because of what I've heard, I'm convinced that for this is how God loved the world, he said. He gave his one and only Son so that everyone who believes in him will not perish, will not be lost to God, but have eternal life. Yeah, but John, how can you say that? I mean, how can you know that? And he would say because of what I saw. Because I was there, because of what I experienced. He was convinced, and whether you're convinced or not yet, that this should at least make you think. That's why he wrote it. He was convinced. He said that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. God came to be one of us. And he said, I'm just telling you what I saw. I'm telling you what I've concluded based on what I heard and what I saw. Right? I was just a simple fisherman. I was just an eyewitness, but I thought what happened was so important that I wanted to document my experience for you, for future generations, but not just simply so you can know what happened. No, it's way, way, way bigger than that. I wrote these things with a really specific purpose in mind. These things I've chosen to document. He said, these conversations I've chosen, these events I chose to document. He said, these are written so that you may continue to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is who he said he is, that he'll do for you what he claims he can do. He's the Son of God, and by believing in him, you will have life by the power of his name. And so I'm excited. This is going to be an awesome series, in spite of the preacher, okay? And before this series is over, we're going to get to go through all 7 of these signs, and it's going to be a lot of fun. There's going to be a lot of conversation, so much new stuff. But my prayer is that, okay, before this series is over, as we move from sign to sign, as we move into our own new normals and new routines, my hope is that you would believe and that you, as John would say, that you would experience a new level, a new paradigm, a new way of looking at life in his name as well. But not just because you by faith, okay? But because you took it from John, an eyewitness to the life and ministry of Jesus. You've not even been invited just to believe in belief. You've not been called to follow Jesus because of faith. It's way, 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 way better than that. And if you've ever felt like you had to adjust the truth to kind of fit your beliefs instead of, adjusting your beliefs to fit the truth, then be sure you don't miss next week. And maybe by next week you can bring somebody back with you, all right? Let me pray with you. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for preserving this in a way that we can still read it today, that we can still learn from the eyewitness account of John. And God, I just pray that you would bring this to life in a way that's very relevant in the way that we approach faith. And the big questions that we have about life every day, God, I just pray that as we look at these signs, as we look at the evidence, that we will have even a greater reason to trust you, to take our steps forward with you. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.